the culture war has been let's beat the other guys. Well, if you're in a let's beat the other guys on the battlefield model, when your positions are not popular in society and you're like a minority position, that is just going to, not only are you going to lose, but people are going to hate you. And so I think we ought to think about how can we like make more friends than enemies, which we have not really focused on doing.
As effeminacy, an inevitable byproduct of godlessness, seeps into a culture, self-loathing festers and human flourishing is vilified. We live in an era that scorns truth and morality, exalting debauchery while normalizing evil. The chaos around us reveals a deep sickness. The sons of Adam, in a pathetic mimicry of their oldest forefather, have forsaken strength, wisdom, and responsibility. They appease deceived women and choose cowardly diplomacy over war with serpents who spread pernicious lies. The emasculation of men, and by extension entire civilizations, has long been the weapon of those who despise God. And what are the consequences of this? They gnaw relentlessly at the foundations of what makes societies strong. What then can be done in the face of such adversity? How should we live in a world hell-bent on opposing God and Christianity? Today I'm joined by Aaron Renn, who writes and speaks prolifically on cultural issues to prepare and equip followers of Christ to live faithfully and positively in a world that has become aggressively opposed to the Christian religion. His work has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, Time, and The Atlantic. He's also the best-selling author of Life in the Negative World. Before transitioning to public policy, Aaron spent 15 years in the technology and management consulting industry. He currently lives in Indianapolis with his wife and son. Aaron Renn, welcome to Of Flames and Crowns. It is a great privilege and honor to have you here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. As we begin, I'm just curious to know what prompted your interest in subjects around culture, economics, and politics. You're quite a prolific writer and speaker on these subjects. And what was it that you had observed or experienced that prompted you to start speaking on these things?
Well, I guess there are a couple things that really caused transitions. I was a corporate consultant in Chicago, helping basically Fortune 500 companies, adapt to changing business and technology landscapes. But I grew up in rural southern Indiana, about 4 miles outside of a town of fewer than 100 people. And so I fell in love with cities like only someone from a tiny town can. And moving to Chicago really got me interested in cities and how they function. And that sort of led me to pivot away from the consulting world into more urban policy. So that was really my first entree into policy. What got me interested in kind of men's issues and religious issues was over a decade ago, I saw that there were so many young men turning to online influencers looking for guidance to life, and they weren't going to the church. I mean, this why men don't go to church was a question for a long time, perennial question. The church had heavily skewed female for a long time. But here were these men turning to these online influencers who at the time were very small, but it was rapidly growing. And I said, wow, although many of these influencers are promoting toxic ideas, bad morals, there's a lot of things they're saying that are actually accurate. Things that the church was not saying. And I'm like, we need to get in the game. And so I didn't see anybody else really engaged on this issue. And so I felt kind of compelled to at least give it a shot by starting a newsletter. I said, I'll try it for a year. And if it hits a certain threshold, I'll keep going. And basically it's a complicated story, but it did. Yeah. And so here we are.
That's awesome. It's a fascinating story. I was just reading on this yesterday. At some point you started it and then I think you shut it down.
Right.
And then all of a sudden some of your work went viral, and here we are.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exceptional. As you look at just what's happened downstream from these influences, gaining the ears and the hearts of young men, what do you see? Do you think we're in a better place for having had these influences? Where are we at the moment?
Well, the influencer world runs the spectrum. There are people like Jocko Willink, who I think is great, former Navy SEAL. Jordan Peterson, I think mostly had kind of healthy things to say. Then you get into Joe Rogan. And again, Rogan is kind of promoting conspiracy theories and UFOs and psychedelics. Not sure that it's all bad by any means. I mean, he's just a character.
Right.
But, to the extent that he gets you into psychedelics, I don't think that's a positive.
Sure.
He could go all the way over to kind of the pickup artists and people like that are definitely bad. So I think it's a mixed bag, if you will. I do think one thing that was very different from my generation, Generation X, growing up in the 80s, high school, even college, we were at sort of the mercy of what quote unquote official sources told us. We had to listen to what we learned in school, what we saw on TV, because there weren't really great alternative sources of information out there.
Yeah.
There were some tiny newsletters about different esoteric subjects, or there were, online bulletin board systems and things like that. But we didn't have the internet. And today, one of the things that's very different is the internet broke the embargo of it. And so the things that we were told that weren't true, it's hard to get away with telling people things that aren't true or hiding information today in a sense. So the example I like to give is one of the most well-attested facts in social science that women initiate the vast majority of divorces, about 70%.
Yeah.
I have never once seen that very basic fact given in any evangelical book or sermon about marriage. In fact, a feminist scholar actually analyzed the language that conservative evangelicals used in their sermons talking about divorce. And she discovered through her language analysis that they framed it primarily as a male-initiated action.
Wow.
So they're talking about it in ways that are quite contrary to reality. Now, of course, there's always, why are all these divorces happening? We don't have, we could get into that. I don't think it's all entirely clear. But the key is, I would say most young men, wow, 70% of the divorces are initiated by women. That's important to know.
Yeah, exactly.
And so things like that massively credentialize the online influencers in ways that, it didn't happen in the past. And even Steven Pinker at Harvard has talked about this, about how people get quote unquote radicalized online because they'll tune into somebody on YouTube and they will hear, a true fact that no one has ever told them before, or that you're not allowed to say in society.
Right.
And then they're like, oh, wow, what else? And then you go down the rabbit hole and not all of it's true. There's all, then you get into the conspiracy theories and other things, or it causes you to adopt very unhealthy attitudes about life. But I think part of the root of it is, when you're not telling the whole truth, the truth, and nothing but the truth, it's not good. And so that's kind of the position I think that, that the church has been in for a while. And so we need to be, not that the church is wrong on everything, but I think, there were some of these things that were just really kind of not accurate.
And since you started speaking about these things, I mean, you've been doing this for several years now. Are you encouraged by any movements that are picking up on what you're saying? Do you see some churches doing a better job at things since you started speaking on these things?
Yeah, I don't know that I've seen any particular change in kind of the evangelical rhetoric around gender, to tell you the truth.
Right.
But what I would say is there's been a change in the landscape of who attends church. So, as I said, church has had a predominantly female skew for a long time. But when it comes to Gen Z, that's no longer true. Among Generation Z, actually slightly more men than women attend church.
Wow.
It's just a sea change. Yeah. Now, most of that is not because men are streaming into church. It's because there's been an accelerated abandonment of religion by women. So young women are like abandoning religion at faster rates than young men have, to the extent that like young men are now more religious, more likely to attend church, although still not at high levels. Now, there are some indications maybe that it's actually it's interesting, it's picking up. So I think that's really going to have an impact as the people who are in your pews the composition changes, particularly in light of like a lot of these young guys who are in church, they've already been exposed to all this stuff online. So let's just take one guy. There's an influencer out there by the name of Andrew Tate. Now, Andrew Tate is definitely one of the more toxic individuals. He's also the kind of person that only would really appeal to the teenage mindset. He's under indictment for sex trafficking in Romania and other things of that nature. But there was a survey done in Britain that 80% of 16 and 17-year-old British boys had seen Andrew Tate content.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's highly likely, right, for young, teenage, early 20s men that they have come across this information.
Yes.
So your ability to kind of like tell these people things contrary to what they're hearing online, they've at least heard the Minority Report. So I think it's going to be a different pastoral challenge today than it was for maybe my generation, where many more people were sort of passively in the pews saying, oh, this guy up here, he's telling me the Bible and preaching the Bible is very good, so I'm just going to take it all in and do what they say.
Yeah.
I think today there's going to be much more skepticism applied because these people have sort of been pre-catechized by the internet, and they're not going to believe some of the boomercon platitudes, I think, in the past. But we'll see how that goes out. But certainly there's a demographic shift going on in the church. And I guess the other thing I would say on that is we've also seen tremendous political polarization among men and women, especially among young people. Right. This is a global phenomenon of women becoming very liberal, men becoming very conservative. Then it's happening at the same time. There's declining marriage rates, declining birth rates. This is particularly bad in South Korea, where we're not rock bottom fertility, and there's actually direct hostility between men and women. I think now as these female parties, I think one of them called like the 4B movement. It's like, don't have anything to do with men, don't have any kids, stuff like that.
Right.
It's very explicitly ideological.
Right.
And of course, we have that on the men's side too. Right. There's this movement called MGTOW, men going their own way, which is like, don't get married. You're going to get, screwed over in divorce court. Don't you dare keep women out of your life. So I think there's more hostility. And then there's the political overlay, young women, especially single women, off the charts high Democratic skew. I think it's not quite as much of a conservative skew among the men, but there's still some of that. And so I think that, by the way, I think these dynamics of negativity between men and women are very, very negative. But I think all that's going to be, when these people show up in church, that's going to be the cultural context of ministry. It's going to be a very different cultural context for the church.
Yes. Almost a year ago, I was speaking at a conference, and there were many young men in the audience, and I was speaking to them around relationships and dating and all of that, and I did an impromptu poll asking how many of them had listened to Andrew Tate before and were following him, and we had young men as young as 13 years old, consuming his content. And I found that fascinating, and I had conversations with some of them after that, just asking what it was about a man like Andrew Tate that would have been appealing to them.
Here's one for you. I spoke at a Christian men's event for a men's ministry earlier this year. And it was, there were some, millennials, but it was very heavily, older millennial, Gen X, boomer.
Yeah.
And I asked the audience, how many of you have heard of Andrew Tate? Maybe a quarter of them had ever heard of Andrew Tate.
Yeah.
So when you consider the ubiquity of young men tuning into Andrew Tate, versus the older Christian men have never heard of it. And I think that's a challenge of our social media era. We really, for a significant period of time in America, we were a mass consumer culture. And this idea of a kind of a common culture probably got going with Hollywood and radio in the early 20th century, but was really in the post-war era where television became so dominant from like 1945 to say 1990. And we had 3 TV networks and 1 newspaper in your town, or maybe a couple newspapers in your town. And that was the media everyone consumed. And that led to something where there was like really tremendous common culture. So like when I grew up, my mom, I didn't stay up late enough to watch The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. But even I, who had probably literally never seen an episode of The Tonight Show before I went to college, knew who Johnny Carson was. And I even knew some of his gags. It's like it was saturated into the culture. And in fact, when I grew up, a lot of what I watched was reruns of the TV shows from like when my mom was a kid, like I Love Lucy or Gilligan's Island. And so there was actually a cultural language, and the boomers were so dominant that like their rock and roll music was popular for a very, very long time. And so, you knew who the famous people were, even if you didn't, watch them or anything about it. Well, now today, there's been since around 1990, people have been talking about the fragmentation of that common culture. First through cable TV. There's that, I think Bruce Springsteen song, 57 channels and nothing on. Now there's not even like cable. Everything is algorithm curated on TikTok to you. And so young people are following, for lack of a better term, micro influencers, although many of them aren't micro. They can have millions. There are people, both for men and women, millions of people are tuning in to people on TikTok or even YouTube that none of us have ever heard of. And that is really a challenging landscape for parenting and ministry when you literally have no idea who's doing it. And one of the things you hear about is that so many Gen Z people are completely ignorant in the sense they just don't know about things that we like. How could you not know that? Like, don't know who Paul McCartney is. Oh, who's that? It's like they've never heard of people. Like, what is going on? Like, they just don't, because their world is TikTok. And it's uber ephemeral in the sense that it's what's happening now. It's these micro influencers. And there's not nearly as many common cultural touchstones, as there used to be.
I'm curious to know if you think that has placed a wedge between fathers and sons and the way that they would relate. Would you say these micro influences are replacing fathers fundamentally?
I don't know about that, but I would, to the extent that your son or your daughter has a smartphone, they're undoubtedly being influenced by things that you know nothing of. Most likely watching hardcore pornography. And even if they don't have the phone, somebody they know does. And so when you think about the exposure to ultra hardcore porn on smartphones today for young people, like that is like just one example of what's going on. But again, when you see the difference between the percentage of young boys watching Andrew Tate and the percentage of their fathers who's never heard of him, I don't know if it's per se a relational wedge, but I think there is a sense in which maybe parents are not as aware. Whereas I think there was enough of a common experience between like me and my boomer parents' generation. So like when you're a teenager getting into trouble, like, oh, I know all about what teenagers do. And there's still some of that. But now there's this other dimension of it that you have no idea what it was. And so there is the different social dynamic. When I was a kid, I had to talk to people on the telephone. Just like my parents had to talk to people on the telephone. Well, now you don't talk to people on the telephone anymore. So there are differences that we need to be sort of clued in on. And I think people are getting more clued on. The NYU professor, Jonathan Haidt, just wrote this best-selling book, An Anxious Generation, about social media. I think, like, what happened, there's a social change, and then there's a problem. And then we do something about the problem, even if we don't fix the problem. So, I was the first generation, child of no-fault divorce. So we had no-fault divorce that got going right around 1970. All these divorces in the 70s. This was, the latchkey kids, all that. And we take a look at that and say, wow, that's not working very well. So what happens in the 80s, there's like a reaction against that with like the whole like baby on board picture. And it's like a very different helicopter parenting. So I'm not saying that was all healthy, but there was something of a reaction of, even if there's divorce, we can't just, this idea that the kids can like be okay. Like, well, we got to do something with the kids. I think social media is kind of like that. It's like came along. Now we're kind of 10 years into the social media era. We're like, oh, look at all these problems. We better put at least something to mitigate the worst of it. So I think there's some of that that's coming, but it won't by any means fix the problem.
Yeah. So something I've heard you speak about before, and there's an article I read that you wrote a few months ago about living in a low trust society. And one of the things that you emphasized was the importance of being trustworthy people in a low trust society. And I'm just curious to know, in a world where people have been seemingly let down by religious leaders, by various institutions, what is it going to take for people to not fall to the temptation of isolating themselves and actually still nurturing a sort of optimism that trust is possible? And this is, and I'm asking also very specifically to young men, right?
Yeah.
Who perhaps feel like they need to rely on micro influences or just internet influences in general, rather than people who are in their actual local spaces.
Yeah, it's complex, and I don't know how it's going to play out. But what I would say is, I think first we have to take stock of the low trust society and calibrate ourselves to reality, which in many ways we still have not done. I mean, especially among people my age or older, maybe even some of the older millennials, we're still steeped in this idea of the higher trust society and the old kind of like Anglo-American values of like fair play and like following the rules and things like that. So I think there are probably a lot of people out there who kind of naively thought, oh, the way you get into college, get into a good college, is you study hard and you get good grades and you get good test scores and you play sports or do something and you apply and you're going to be judged on your merits and you're going to get in. That's not how college admissions works. Okay. And you can see like this Varsity Blues scandal where all these like even Hollywood kind of minor celebrities were engaging in chicanery to falsely get their kids into these great schools.
Right.
Everybody else is gaming the system. Like they're gaming the system. And so everything is now about gaming the system. And so if you think that like you're going into a situation where everybody's sort of like playing by the rules, you're going to get tated and the chump, you're going to turn into a chump. And I think there's a lot of gaslighting here going on, with sort of like middle class Americans or evangelicals. It's like, you need to be a good citizen. You need to be willing to pay taxes to support all these programs, and you got to follow all the rules, and you need to be pro-social, and you need to support the institutions, the government. You're giving all this stuff. And you turn around and you see all these, migrants coming in, getting, scam temporary protected status, having all these NGOs stuffed full of federal government money, giving them these things. They're getting, paid dirt by the company. And it's like, oh, are they playing by the rules? And it's one of the things like during COVID, I can't tell you how many times I read a evangelical pastor talk about Romans 13. Got to submit to the governing authorities. I have never once heard an evangelical pastor tell illegal immigrants that they need to submit to the governing authorities? Why doesn't Romans 13 apply to them?
Right.
So I think there's all this gaslighting in which it's like you need to be playing by one set of rules, but we're going to let everybody else play by a completely different set. And I think that's one of the realities of the low trust society. In the low trust society, if you're just being this like rule follower, invest in the system kind of thing, you're just getting exploited. You're getting exploited by people. Now, I'm not saying you break the rules. I don't believe in breaking the rules.
Right.
I was not one of these anti-maskers, for example, in COVID. I basically got along with what people wanted. On the other hand, you got to realize, like, hey, do I want to be investing into a system where everybody else is not investing? They're taking it out. They're looking at it as a transaction. They're seeing what they can get. And unfortunately, you have to have a very transactional relationship to many of our social institutions today, because that's the nature of the beast. That's how it works. Just like we went to a foreign country, we would have to adapt to the system there, and now our country may be different than what we've been told it is, or maybe what it was supposed to believe. So I think we do need to recalibrate our relationship. At the same time, we do have to guard against cynicism. And we do have to find ways to create zones of trust within the system. One of the examples that I always refer to, and I think is sort of aspirational, maybe inspirational, was 19th century Quakers in England. So this was before there were any regulations. It was the Wild West era of capitalism, before we had the regulatory state. And conservatives love to complain about the regulatory state, but the regulatory state has some good things about it, like the Pure Food and Drug Act. I'm glad we can't sell adulterated food. But in those days, when it really was caveat emptor, people liked doing business with the Quakers because they knew the Quakers were honest. They weren't going to screw you over. And so very influenced by an article I read about the Cadbury chocolate company, which was a Quaker business. And one of the ways that Cadbury became such a big, successful company is because other chocolate companies of that era were like putting in sawdust and iron filings into their chocolate to try to save a buck. They're like, no, we're actually selling chocolate. You're going to get a good product from us. We're going to treat our workers fairly. And it became a competitive advantage for them to do that. And so I've always had this idea that not being a naive chump about the world, but by being a source of trust, a trustworthy person for others, you can succeed. Now, unfortunately, I haven't necessarily seen that play out. And maybe the sad reality is that the opposite is true. I've been on Twitter and watching people tweet about this Hurricane Helene response, which is bad. There's no doubt it's bad. So many of these tweets look suspect. Wow, my cousin told me there's like 34 dead babies on his street alone, and stuff like it. So you're hearing a lot of stuff that's obviously not true. There's no photographs. There's no external vetting. And then, there's an image that went viral. It's like, if this were, Hurricane Katrina, this would have been the cover image of every newspaper in America. Apparently it was an AI-generated image. So I don't know where all this is coming from, but I don't have confidence in what anybody is tweeting, about that stuff. And somebody will tweet something, oh, this was terrible. And then it's like community note on Twitter. This is actually from a flood in Czechoslovakia back in the 1990s. This is old footage. And so here's the problem. I would think, wow, wouldn't it be great if my Twitter feed can be full of rock solid, trustworthy information? Maybe the sad reality is people want more fake news. They want the slop. They want this kind of stuff. They don't actually want the truth. And there's like that line from John. This was like judgment, that the light came into the world, but people preferred the darkness to the light. And there's a sense a lot of people prefer darkness to light. And maybe that's the tragic reality of our world, that the way to be very successful today is not to be this beacon of trust, but to be like an Alex Jones. InfoWars may be the template for how you get it. And again, Rogan with his like UFO conspiracy theories and Egyptian technologies and let's take some psychedelics. It sells.
Mm.
That's the reality is maybe that's the sad reality of the world we're going to live in. Now, I'm not saying that we need to engage in that ourselves, but I think we have to take the measure of the world that we live in. And so I would love it if there was there people are going to flock to the trustworthy, but sadly, maybe they aren't.
Mm. And what would you say? How can those who are trustworthy find each other?
I say this: what happened in low trust societies? Trust works overwhelmingly through family networks. In the Middle East, it's through family clans. There are these extended family networks, and in China traditionally, and so your number one way that you have a high trust network in a low trust society is to have a large family network to draw on, which is precisely what people don't have today.
Yes.
They're very atomized.
Yes.
They're not getting married. They're not having kids. And so if you have lots of kids and lots of cousins, and that creates a very different dynamic. There's something about family that it's a unique relationship. So I moved to Chicago. This really struck me at the time. I moved to Chicago in 1992, and I needed to find a place to live. So I had an aunt and uncle who lived in this great neighborhood there. It's my mom's sister. And they said, great, come up and stay with us. And just walk around our neighborhood, and you'll find a for rent sign and all that before the internet. Right? So I'm there, and they're like, oh, we're gonna be on. Here's the keys to our house. Just come in there. And I thought about that. I'd met these people like before. I'd seen them, several times. But maybe I bet I'd met them 10 times total in my life prior to that. And yet, here's the keys to our house. Just stay with. And there is something, because I was their nephew, because I was a family member. There was an instant level of trust.
Yes.
That came with that. And families have essentially enforcement mechanisms. If somebody in the family doesn't behave well, there are like social consequences within the family. And so there is something about there is no substitute for that in a low trust environment. Of course, you can't necessarily gin up a family network if you don't have one, but people who get married have kids. That's like the first start of building something.
Yes.
I think, like that, because that's your number one network to draw on. Obviously, church can potentially be that, but you got to try. You got to seek it out, because if you're in a low trust society, you need to have people you can rely on. In life, maybe it's your fraternity brothers. And there's something about, I was never in a fraternity. I was never a joiner of things. Maybe I should have been, because you could have here's a relationship with people that that's going to be something you can draw in the future. Things of that nature. That's just a few kind of starter ideas.
Yes. Yes, it sounds like recovering the strength of the household is going to be a very key strategy in order to begin to rebuild I'll say high trust society, if we can put it that way.
I mean, so much of America, it was built on sort of a high trust thing. This idea, I can move to New York where I don't know anybody,
Right.
and everything I need is available for me in the marketplace. And I can just rely on sort of commercial transactions to substitute for high trust networks, because there's a certain, trust level in the society, it's there. Well, I think as that declines over time, not that we're not going to be able to draw on commercial networks, but this idea that the high trust society means I don't need trusted counterparties in how I live my life, because I could just rely on all these, commercial ties, or just like weak ties among people. I didn't necessarily have to trust them all that much. Maybe it's going to be, maybe it's going to change, maybe it's going to change.
I'm just curious. I mean, a moment ago you had mentioned sort of how the regulatory state came into being. As we develop a high trust society, what would happen to the regulatory state? Would its purpose be proved unnecessary at that point? And
In a
should
high
that
trust or a low,
even be a goal in order to get to a point where we don't have a regulatory state?
I am not one of these people that believes you can get rid of the regulatory state or the administrative state. So if you go back to the era before we had that, really prior to the second industrial revolution, with a predominantly rural agrarian society, people produced most of what they consumed at home, and maybe they did business with people in their local community. There were sort of personal ties there, right? And again, there were kind of enforcement mechanism against scammers. Now, there were a lot of scammers. America was not necessarily a high trust society at that time, because people could come to town, maybe scam you, and then skip town and go somewhere else. Frankly, it wasn't even, I think, until the 1970s that we sort of had a national credit reporting system. So you could skip town on your debts, go somewhere else. And so there were a lot of the classic snake oil salesman, right? Or P.T. Barnum's quip that there's a sucker born every minute. America was really not necessarily a high trust society in that era, but your networks were smaller. You didn't rely as much. As we became an urbanized society, as we became an industrialized society, as we stopped, it used to be, people made their own clothes at home. When America was founded, most people were spinning their own cloth and wool, making their own clothes, producing all their own food. And now you're buying it at the store. So you don't know what's in it. You didn't grow it. You didn't see what happened to it. They're very different. So as we got into that era, we realized, oh yeah, we need to make sure that actually, the meat you're consuming is actually not diseased or all that stuff. So it became critical. The other thing is, when you live in a rural area, you don't need a lot of government in a rural area. But when you have a big city, you need a lot of government. You need people to pick up trash off the streets. You need street lighting. You need police. You need fire departments. You can't just rely on the bucket brigade to put out the fires anymore. And so we have big cities and big corporations. You basically need to have big government to go along with it. And so I think that is inevitable in a sort of technological society. Just think about, for example, the military. If you want to have a war today, you need to have a sophisticated military. It takes a huge bureaucracy to sustain our military. It takes huge logistics operations, right? We need to fight a war, and we need to keep our troops supplied in Afghanistan. I mean, one of the reasons we're one of the few countries, maybe the only country in the world that can truly project power anywhere around the world outside of our near abroad, because nobody else has the logistical ability to do it.
Right.
They could maybe send some troops somewhere, but they couldn't get them supplies. And so it's just a different world. I think it's kind of a fiction that we're going back to this minimalist, laissez-faire, pre-industrial. So I think the regulatory state actually helped produce a higher trust society because we now have some certainty that somebody is keeping an eye on what's going on. So I think initially it was probably very good. Like all things, you can have too much of a good thing. And now we've got into this very sclerotic system where the actual overseers are themselves not trustworthy. And so when you don't trust the FDA, when you don't trust FEMA, when you don't trust any of these institutions, then that's a problem. And, sadly, the corruption of our institutions, but the decline in trust in our institutions is fully warranted. In fact, as I said, we may still trust them too much relative to the amount of trust they deserve. And so, yeah, is FEMA doing a good job right now? I don't think so. Is our government prioritizing the needs of its own people or prioritizing things in other countries, other things? I don't think so. So I think we've reached a problem. I think, I think a lot of conservatives would argue that's intrinsic to government. But I don't think that's the case, because other countries like Switzerland, for example, Japan, not that their governments are perfect by any means, but, they actually are doing a pretty good job. You look at the high-speed rail in Japan, it's pretty darn good. The trains run on time in Switzerland. And so I think there was a time when we had high-functioning, highly competent government that could do things like build the interstate highway system, win World War II, pull off the Manhattan Project, put a man on the moon. Like, that was an example of like state action that was highly successful and deservedly high trust. So can we get back there? I don't know. But I don't think it's intrinsically the case that these entities can't function and be trustworthy. And in fact, you even see that, like where I live in suburban Indianapolis, our government is very high functioning. It does a lot of things very well, and I think deservedly pretty high trust.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I've got a couple questions on that. One, do you think that it's possible that the regulatory state, as it's become bigger, as it's become more pervasive in society, has disincentivized personal responsibility, and that personal responsibility in turn creating a low trust society?
Yeah, I certainly think that the government has become way too involved in too many aspects of our life. Uh, the idea here is there's been a lot of people writing about this, but the government today no longer purely delivers services. It's involved in a project, and has been since before I was born, of a therapeutic reconstruction of the populace. So the idea, a lot of this developed in the wake of World War II, with ideas like this authoritarian personality. It's like, how could Germany become fascist? And so there's this idea that fascism is lurking inside the suburban American family, and therefore we need to reconstruct their attitudes and ultimately put them under the thumb of the state. Now, probably, candidly, there were probably some elements of that were good. There was like very bad ideas about race that a lot of people held that probably did need to change. Certainly gone far beyond any level of sanity, especially in terms of the government basically viewing that they own your children. You don't own your children. To the point where, your parental rights are certainly not secure in a blue state. Maybe not even in red states either. And so I think that's an example of where we've gone too far. But again, the idea of like, oh, we need to get rid of the welfare state. We're not getting rid of the welfare state. Again, this idea of self-reliance. Self-reliance is like that's an idea that comes from a pre-existing or prior economic structure. When we had a largely agrarian society, there was a sense in which, if you stay sober, if you work hard on your farm, you're probably going to survive. There may be a lot of hardships. Maybe there's a drought, there's extraordinary circumstances. You can experience bad luck and go broke, but there was a lot in your hands. You could start a business, you could hustle. Well, today, most of us are at the mercy of macroeconomic forces that we can neither, understand or control. When the factory closed in Youngstown, all those guys got laid off, and they didn't have any skills besides making steel. They were going to struggle. And I can go get a job, at the grocery store or something like that. Yeah, there's things you can do. I'm not saying you have no agency, but it's a very different situation. And so I don't think we're going to go to a world where we don't have unemployment insurance. We're not going to let people starve, right? Because, they're not working or something like that. We're not going to cut people off from that. And there's also a lot of things like, back in the day when we had no safety net, there was no real health care either. Medical technology was much less advanced. Today, people need access to sophisticated medical care, or else we just let people die. Are we going to let people die? Probably not. So I do think the welfare state produces perverse incentives, and there's a lot of things that need to be done differently. At the same time, this idea, I think, that we can get rid of the welfare state is simply a mirage. We're not going to do that because fundamentally, we're not going to let people starve.
So would you say then, I mean, I guess my concern around that would be, as the welfare state persists, the strength of the household will always be compromised to some degree. I'd even say you could stretch that out and say the ability for the church to really influence society as well would also be somewhat compromised. The welfare state having created a sense of over dependency, for example. I mean, we were speaking about masculinity a moment ago, and I'm just wondering to what degree the welfare state has contributed to a sort of emasculation where men aren't expected to provide, men aren't expected to protect because that's all is outsourced to the state. So with that in mind, shouldn't the goal be to have individuals and families assuming more responsibility for themselves, sure, within the context of a community, and relying less on some kind of welfare state that would continue to make society struggle in a sense?
Well, certainly there are bad incentives baked into the welfare state. One of it, there's this idea that, oh, immigrants don't qualify for welfare. Well, there's a sense in which that's true, but it's really not true. So when you start peeling the onion, what we see is many of these people who are here on, say, temporary protected status, who are not technically immigrants, but none of them are ever going to be asked to leave. We've had people here 25 years now because, in theory, there was an earthquake in El Salvador back in the 1990s, so they couldn't go home until they recovered from the earthquake. But nobody's ever going to make these people leave. They qualify for all these benefits. So they basically qualify for tons of stuff. And so, if we didn't, if it were really a hard line, if you come here from a foreign country, you get nothing. That would make it less attractive to come here, for example. So, there's no doubt that Europe, for example, attracts a ton of migrants because there's a welfare state that provides it there. Something that was not the case. So, my mother's family came from Sicily. Something like a third of the people who came over from Italy in the Ellis Island era went back. It was like if you couldn't hack it, you had to go back.
Yeah.
And so, so I think that there are things like that. And certainly it was the case that one of the primary goals of the feminist movement was to reduce female dependency on male provision. I mean, that is overwhelmingly the goal. I don't like to use terms like emasculation. There's certainly the idea that we want women to be able to make their own money in a career. And if they don't make money in career, then we're going to have the welfare state. And that is certainly a major contributor to, decline of marriage, divorce, etc. And let's be clear, even the church is in on that. Because I would argue, other than the government itself, the church is the number one facilitator of divorce in the United States. Because, you look at the evangelical church, basically the official position is, single mothers are heroes. And I've never heard of a church that basically, if a woman divorced her husband without biblical grounds, would refuse to basically, oh, this is amazing, we got to help her out. There's a ready-made support network for you if you want to divorce your husband with or without any reason. As I say, when I'm talking about adultery or abuse or something like that, just like, no, you're going to get like aid and comfort from the church in doing that. And so, there's a lot of things that do essentially, weaken the family. I don't see any prospect that that's going to change. But undoubtedly, one of the biggest drivers of the decline of marriage is that even in places like Norway, women still expect to marry up, or at least marry someone who's at their level in terms of income. So to the extent that female income goes up because they've entered the workforce, that makes it a much higher expectation of what a man's going to bring to the table in terms of income, and makes more men at the bottom considered less marriageable. So there's men are unmarriageable because they don't have jobs, they don't make a lot of money, etc. And this is why marriage is particularly in decline among people without degrees, because those men make less money and are less attractive marriage partners. Now, you might say that would be an incentive for men to work harder so they could make more money so they could get married. So there is a sense in which this incentive structure is what it is, but like men could choose to respond to that in a different way. And so I don't like to just deliver man up lectures, but I do think there's a sense which, yes, not just the marriage market, but like the decline of the industrial economy and things have disadvantaged working class men in a lot of ways that was just they couldn't necessarily do anything about. And yet, I think the lesson we can take from that is you need to work harder and you need to do whatever. And like it's interesting, Andrew Tate and a lot of these guys online, it's like the grind set, that's their whole thing. It's like you got to hustle, you got to like be an entrepreneur, and they are sort of like telling people to do that. Now, of course, his business is sort of preying on these other people.
Right.
But I think there is this sense, and it's weird that there's a weird working class appeal to a lot of these people, because there is a sense of like, okay, you have to make it happen, and that is the case because basically most societies have always treated men as like somewhat expendable. They're the ones that are sent out to die in society, and historically, like I don't know if it's most men, but certainly at least 40% of men never had children.
Hmm.
So this idea that every man could get married and have kids, like that's like an anomaly in a sense in our society. And so that there's a sort of logic, maybe I don't know if it's encoded into the human species, but certainly into human culture, that there's a sort of different, the sexes are different. So there's going to be a view of society for women that's going to be one way, and there's going to be a different expectation on men. And in a sense that the competitive environment for men is more brutal. There's the alpha male at the top who had his harem in a polygamous society, and a lot of losers at the bottom. And we're not quite like that today by any means, but it is a much more ruthless competitive logic. I think for men. And so it's a challenging environment for sure. Now, on the other hand, I think all of these changes have not necessarily rebounded to women's benefits either. There's something that one scholar called the paradox of declining female happiness. If you go back to the 70s, at the dawn of second wave feminism, female happiness has declined significantly, both absolutely and relative to men.
Yes.
Women are actually like less happy relative to men now. And there is a lot of, being a single mom, in a working class environment at the Murphy Brown, it's very, very tough. There's no doubt that many women face very hot, challenging lives. And you look at the share of women taking psychiatric medications. Some surveys suggest a quarter of, women. That's like huge. And you just have to read all the blogs and the things to realize that they're not happy. I don't think our society, I think there is a way in which you could say, yes, our society has decided to favor women over men. But I would actually argue it hasn't been great for women either. And they have a lot of legitimate complaints about, the hand that they've been dealt as well. There's a whole Henry Kissinger quip. I don't know if it's really Henry Kissinger, but it's attributed to him. No one will ever win the battle of the sexes because there's too much fraternizing with the enemy. And I think there's a point in which men and women are interdependent. And it is essentially, I think, difficult to impossible for there to be sustainably, one group's going to win, the other group's going to lose.
Right.
Because it's just like, there's all these incels.
Yeah.
Okay, there's all these incels. The involuntarily celibate, which is an actual explicit movement of young men who say no women will have sex with them, no women will go on a date with them. They are complete kind of outcasts in the dating market. And those guys, many of them have actually become, some of them become actual terrorists. There's been literal terrorist attacks and mass shootings, things like that coming from these guys. Nobody has any pity for them. But then you hear, the complaint of 30-something Christian women, there's no men to marry. Where are the men? Because they're getting more degrees than men are getting. And the numbers just don't add up.
Right.
There's going to be so when you look at, oh, there's this big group of loser men over here, it means there's going to be some women losing out as well.
Absolutely.
Women losing out over here, men are losing out. There's this idea. This is the internet sort of flipped it. And this is one thing where I think that the online men's influencer space, so-called manosphere, has really gone in a bad direction because it has become in many ways very misogynistic and negative towards women. But, if women are not flourishing, the odds that men are going to flourish are pretty low. So I think there's a sense in which these dynamics are serving nobody well. And that's why I don't like to use terms like emasculation and some of these things that I think have become prevalent, because I do think it promotes a kind of zero-sum thinking that in order for men to succeed, women have to lose. And I think probably are there certain affirmative action programs and things that are somewhat discriminatory? Sure, I think white women have been by far the biggest beneficiaries of the DEI movement. For example, in the city where I live, in the last 3 to 4 years, a very high percentage of new kind of organizational leaders have been white women. Because they count as quote unquote diverse candidates, but they're not really diverse. So it's like, how can you be diverse without really being diverse? We'll hire a white woman. And so I do think if there's that kind of like thumb on the scale, maybe there's there are some kind of, call it zero-sum elements there. But for the most part, that's not really the case. And I think we need to recognize the way in which the current system is neither serving men nor women well. And we shouldn't, we shouldn't, you don't want equality, by cutting other people down. So it's like, I don't think we want, we don't want men, we want to raise men up. We don't want to cut women down. I think it's that. In fact, women themselves, many of them are not happy and not flourishing in the way that they would want. So we should not become anti-woman, I think, through this, which a lot of these people do.
And I suppose that the solution there fundamentally would be doing things on God's terms, right? Employing the sort of systems that he's given us, embracing the sort of masculinity that he calls us to embrace, embracing the sort of femininity that women ought to embrace, that he has beautifully and wonderfully designed in order for society to harmoniously function, right? And I suppose a lot of this would be a consequence of a society that has fundamentally become godless. Would you agree with that assertion?
That's a complicated one, because the reality is the Bible doesn't really specify a lot about the specifics of how some of these things are supposed to work. So I think they're kind of general principles. At the same time, how do we apply those principles in today's world? Because again, we live in a industrialized society. So if you go back to the pre-industrial era, which is, the Bible and all the way forward to that, there's this idea, that women were sort of workers at home. But in a pre-industrial homestead society, the man was also working at home, and they were both engaged in complementary acts of production. Well, now when the household basically doesn't do anything, the household is no longer a center of production. It's merely a center of consumption. Mm-hmm. And so in that environment, what does it mean, for women's roles in society? And that's why I don't go along with this idea that, women shouldn't have a job outside of the house or something like that. And I think the reality is we've seen that sort of was not necessarily a life that appealed to a lot of people. So for some people it does, but for others it didn't. And that's one of the things that actually produced feminism. In an industrialized society, when, work at home means grocery shopping, it doesn't mean food preservation and preparation and making clothes and other things that were vitally as important to the functioning of the household and the survival and the thriving of the household as what the husband was doing in the fields and building barns and stuff like that. It's a very different economic equation. This great sort of radical Catholic writer named Ivan Illich, who's one of the most profound one of the most profound sort of critics of modern industrial society. And he had this term, he wrote a great book called Shadow Work. And he's like, it's really what we do today at home is very different from what people used to do in the pre-industrial economy. So it is essentially unpaid attendant labor to industrial economy. So we're not producing, but we're doing things for free to sort of facilitate industrialization. A canonical example of that would be commuting. When I commute to my job, I'm essentially spending time that's unpaid, that's necessary for the industrial economy to function. Because if people didn't commute, there wouldn't be workers. And so I'm being forced to absorb that commuting cost. But everybody hates commuting. You know, it's commuting, the work I do by commuting to my job is not work in the sense of growing crops to feed my family. It was work. You know, and so in essence, like, you know, buying food at the grocery store is unpaid labor that is not the same as what it used to be. We're essentially servicing an industrial economy. And so that's very complicated. But I do think we need to challenge ourselves to think about what does this look like in an industrial society where the home is no longer a site of production. A famous Proverbs 31 woman, you know, yes, her husband is at the gates of the city, representing the household in the public affairs of the city. So he had this certain external role. He had a role. But what is she doing? She is overseeing a vast household enterprise, right? She's not, you know, doing cross stitch. And so I think there's a sense of what does it look like for a woman to have a role like that today is something to think of. I think we have to have a better answer for women's roles in society than simply stay home, cook, clean, raise kids, which is what candidly a lot of evangelicals think that it. Now, clearly, women are always going to be primary in being childcare. That's just, again, the feminists are never going to get there. There's always going to be sex role division of labor. We see that even in the Nordic countries, again, the most gender equal countries in the world, all these laws, etc. And yet, men and women still work in almost completely different occupations. You know, and so we're never going to have this sameness. There's always going to be a gender polarity. There's going to be a distinction between male and female. But we have to think about how that manifests in our world, I think, in a healthy way. And I don't profess to have all the answers, but we shouldn't be, you know, we shouldn't have like simplistic, facile solutions to it either.
So I want to get your thoughts on this. As we live and continue to live as Christians in what you've termed as negative world, what does and what could cultural reform look like? Well, what is it that you would want Christians to focus on in order to achieve some kind of reform, in order to make the most of this moment?
Yeah, so Tim Keller, in his book Center Church, which is his church planning manual, my favorite book of his, he takes H. Richard Niebuhr's famous Christ and culture model from the 1950s and sort of puts his gloss on it and coming up with 4 styles of church that he calls transformational, relevance, two kingdoms, and counterculture. Transformational is the idea that the gospel, it's a sort of post-millennialist vision of, you know, the gospel sort of takes over the world and the world is being transformed through the power of the church. And he would have put, like the religious right in that category. I think correctly, because the idea of the religious right, kind of the cultural war movement, was to transform society through politics and to use politics to bring sort of the laws of society into alignment with God's laws. And of course, Keller himself was also a transformationalist in a sense. He thought that the gospel could transform New York City. And he talked about that a lot. I think in a negative world where Christians are no longer a moral majority, but a moral minority, we need to turn the dial, not flip the switch, but turn the dial to be less concerned about cultural transformation and more focused on being a counterculture. Or, as I like to put it, we need to be a lot more worried about what we're doing than what other people are doing. Because in fact, the church is weak. It's very weak. I mean, every time I open up my computer and get on the internet, there is another scandal from another big time pastor. Like, how many big name pastors have blown up in scandals? It's crazy. We don't have our house in order. And I think the first thing is to put your house in order. And and that's where I think we have not done. We do not have a strong enough culture in the church that is meaningfully distinct from the world around us. Now, that's not true everywhere, but I think that's true in most places. The church is way too conformed to the culture. And I think when you become like a minority in a society whose values are very different, you have to create an ecosystem in which you can authentically live out your values. You can put the most extreme case, maybe, of people who've done this, of the Amish. The Amish created an entirely parallel society, or maybe Hasidic Jews are sort of like that as well. I don't think we need to become like that. But, maybe there's something to learn from the Mormons, who created a very strong culture to sustain a religious movement that was definitely frowned upon, for most of America history, and is still being frowned upon by many people today. And they've managed to sustain very healthy societies. And that's why, like, Utah is like the highest functioning state in America. And there's a reason for that. It's because they created a culture that sustains that kind of life. And so we need to have that same sort of culture in the evangelical church, which we have not had to have traditionally because we just were a Christian society. It was a Protestant society. The institutions of society, like public schools, where there's prayer and Bible reading in schools, and it basically reinforced sort of basic Christian morality. Well, it's not like that anymore. And so now we have to be much more self-conscious about stewarding our own community. The first culture to transform is our own.
That's very good. And just as we end this, one of the things that you've emphasized is the need for victory at a moral level, especially in the midst of cultural conflict. Do you believe that this has been a missing element in modern times? And how do you envision applying moral caliber in a broader society?
Yes, I took this from the paleoconservative military historian and strategist, William Lind, and this fourth generation war concept. And fourth generation war is basically guerrilla warfare. So guerrilla warfare is asymmetric. So if you think back about, say, World War II, you had two opposing armies on opposite sides of the battlefield. They both have tanks. They both have soldiers in uniform. They both have planes. And they're going at each other over territory. Guerrilla warfare is very different. On one side, you got this army with traditional, and on the other hand, you have this insurgent force that may not wear uniforms. That's probably not following the Geneva Conventions. And it can be very difficult to win a guerrilla warfare or a guerrilla war if you're the traditional military, even if you have vastly greater power, military might, you often lose. And his argument was one reason you lose is because you lose at what he called the moral level of war. And so the moral level of war, yes, it's about morality in a sense of behaving morally, but it's about a couple other concepts as well. It's about winning hearts and minds, winning the affections of the people. It's also about sustaining your morale for the long term. So if you look at someplace like Afghanistan, we went in there and knocked Afghanistan over quite easily. We went into Iraq, knocked Iraq government over quite easily, but we lost the peace. In fact, the Taliban are back in charge in Afghanistan. How did that happen? It wasn't a military defeat. We won all the battles, basically. They won the war. And so
we didn't win where it mattered most.
Right. And like we were never able to, and maybe, and I'm not going to say, there was some simple formula we should have taken. The truth is there may have been no roadmap to victory, but when you create essentially a corrupt regime in Kabul, propped up with military power, and your own troops are living in this safe green zone environment while the Taliban are out living in caves. Like that right there, you see it. And this was, he actually Lind used the provocative example of Osama bin Laden. Here was a guy who's worth $100 million, decides to go live in a cave in Afghanistan to fight for his cause. Like, it's like the monks used to get, you renounce the whole world, you give up all your riches, like St. Francis. That tremendous moral authority comes from giving up comfort in order to endure hardship and privation. People see you have skin in the game. And so it's very complicated, and I can't go into it in here, but I mean, we actually have to win hearts and minds. And I think too much of the evangelical church has been about fighting with people. The culture war has been, let's beat the other guys. Well, if you're in a let's beat the other guys on the battlefield model, when your positions are not popular in society and you're like a minority position, that is just going to, not only are you going to lose, but people are going to hate you. And so I think we ought to think about how can we like make more friends than enemies, which we have not really focused on doing. And Tim Keller had this line one time, about urban churches. How do you have to succeed if you want to be an urban church? He's like, you need to be world famous for helping the poor. You want to be a church that, like, even if people hate you, they will say, man, I don't like these guys or what they're doing, but where would we be if not for them because of all the good they're doing? I actually think that's a bad example because the political left actually doesn't like churches helping the poor because they think that's the government's job, and it actually undermines the case for government programs.
Right.
At the same time, this gets to the trust paradigm. How do you do things that make people like you, not hate you? How do you provide like tangible public goods to people? And so, one example that's a small example that I can give from here in Moscow, Idaho, was a couple years ago. Some people from the Christ Church community decided to start a 4th of July parade. Apparently, there hadn't been a 4th of July parade in Moscow for a very long time, so we're going to start a 4th of July parade. And let's just create a fun, patriotic, non-religious parade that people want to go have fun at. Like, oh, can you do something like that? It's like, oh, these guys are actually a value add in my community. Or is the only time they ever hear about you is when you open up the newsletter. And this happened in my town. This isn't even a religious thing. It's more of a political conservative thing. This local Moms for Liberty group, was distributing flyers with a Hitler quote on the cover. And another guy went to a school board meeting and like a gun fell out of his pocket. And stuff like that just alienates normal people. Try not to gratuitously alienate normal people. So there is a sense in which I'm not saying that you can never fight. So I'm not saying there's no acquiring power, all that. I'm not one of these all power is bad kind of people. But there is a sense that we have to, you want to win people to your cause. You got to think about that. It's not just about winning the election so we control the majority of the legislature so we can do what you want. That model was great in the 1980s, in theory, because Republicans were on an upswing. Oh, we're winning the presidency. Oh, 1994, we're winning the House of Representatives. Well, now Republicans, there's a great future maybe for the Republican Party, but it's not going to be a religious future, as we're already seeing is the Republican Party's running away from abortion as fast as they can. So if your whole model is based on winning through political, kind of high stakes political conflict, you're going to lose in a negative world because the majority of the people don't want it. And some of this stuff I think is dumb. People want pot to be legal. I think that's a bad idea. But in a democracy, the majority win. It's like H.L. Mencken's quip. Democracy is the theory that the people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard.
Right.
And so that's what it is. And so I do think it's like, again, this idea that let me give you an example of something that really is just totally inappropriate behavior. There's an Atlantic reporter by the name of Tim Alberta, and works for a major media publication. he is an evangelical. He openly says he's an evangelical. His dad was an evangelical pastor. His dad was a church planter in the evangelical Presbyterian Church, which is a basically evangelical denomination. And he wrote a book, Tim Alberta hated Donald Trump, and he wrote a book about Donald Trump. It was very negative. And his dad died. And so they had a big funeral for his dad at the church. And he comes back to his dad's funeral. And so he goes back to the church his dad pastored, and he's there at his dad's funeral. And people start coming up to him, harassing him about his negative reporting on Donald Trump. People are calling it, they're calling into question whether he's a Christian because he doesn't like Donald Trump at his dad's funeral. And so he tells that story in his book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, which is basically a complete hostile hatchet job on Trump supporting conservative evangelicals. Well, I can see why he wrote the book. If they really did that, and I have no reason to believe they didn't, yeah, that's very alienating. And it's like such a low class behavior. There are a lot of, unfortunately, people who engage in very low class behavior that makes people mad. If they're going to make, it's like, I look at Paul. Paul got thrown in jail, he got beaten, all this stuff happened. He wasn't afraid of making people mad at him.
Yeah.
But he didn't go out of his way to offend people. When he was in Athens, he's trying to appeal to them on the basis of God. When he's in front of the priest in Jerusalem, he's like trying to reason with the different governors, and he's like, he's not trying to be gratuitously offensive. He's going to be offensive when the truth of the gospel. He said, "I'm not shunned to declare unto you the whole counsel of God." I'm going to tell you the unvarnished truth, and if people don't like that, throw me in jail. But I'm not going to be like a jerk. And I feel like that's a problem that we need to face, and we need to focus. We need to be much less gratuitously alienating, and actually try to win friends rather than make enemies. Maybe that's unpopular, but that's my point of view.
Well, I appreciate that very much. I think your insights have been very rich, and again, I count it a great privilege to actually have you out here and have these all important conversations that really do help Christians get a better idea of how we can live faithfully in the world that God calls us to live in. So thank you, Aaron. I really appreciate you being on Flames and Crowns, and hopefully we can have you here again.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.